Hey, everybody, this is Tom Webster at Sounds Profitable, and it's time for this week's Data Decoded. In Data Decoded each week, I like to take a look at one piece of data and explode it into fragments of consciousness and awareness to provide some context so that you can help process this data better, understand it a little more, and work with it for your benefit, let's hope. This week, I want to take a look again at a study that we just put out at Sounds Profitable. It was our first quarter research study called The Medium Moves the Message. And The Medium Moves the Message is a comparative analysis of the brand metrics and kind of effectiveness of advertising across three different channels. We looked at broadcast radio, network and cable TV, and podcasting. And we looked at the top 5 brands in each by share of voice, the 5 brands that dominated each of those channels. One of the things that we learned in The Medium Moves the Message is that podcasting is exceptional at what we call the mid and lower funnel brand metrics, right? If you imagine the consumer journey from I just heard about this to I actually buy it as a funnel, at the top of that funnel where you have the most people are the people who become aware of a brand. And then as you go down through that sort of customer journey, the customer circles the drain to a smaller and smaller point until they are deposited into the great void and purchase the product. And in between, they go through steps like they become more favorable towards the product. They become more willing to consider a purchase about it. Maybe they learn more information. And then finally, they take action. And what we showed in The Medium Moves the Message is that podcasting is exceptional at those mid and lower funnel measures. But it's also pretty good at driving awareness, especially if you have a new brand that you're trying to introduce to the market. And it's not a brand that is necessarily widely known to the public outside of podcasting or outside of any media channel for that matter. So I want to show you an example of that with Athletic Greens. Now, Athletic Greens, one of the top advertisers in podcasting, one of the top 5 in share of voice from last year, but not really a heavy advertiser if they even advertise at all in things like radio and television. So the overall awareness of the brand across the general public is fairly low. Now, on this slide, if you look all the way on the left, that 6% bar there, that is the percentage of Americans who are not weekly podcast consumers who say that they are familiar with the brand Athletic Greens. Now, I find it really helpful on graphs like this to sometimes put real numbers instead of percentages, because percentages, especially with brands that maybe don't have a huge amount of awareness, percentages can be deceiving. It's not hard to drive growth there, right? If I were to tell you that I could take your initial investment and return it 100 times, you might be impressed. But if I told you you could only invest a penny, $1 might not excite you. But that's not what we're looking at here. Here we are, in fact, looking at millions of people. That 6% of non-podcast listeners, people who don't listen to podcasts every week, that's about 10 million Americans 18 plus, right? So it's not a small number, but it's certainly a minority of Americans. So that's about 10 million. Now, the next number, the only other one I want to look at here is the bar immediately to the right of that. And that is the percentage of weekly podcast consumers who say that they have heard of Athletic Greens. That number is 24%. But again, it's useful here to put a real number behind it. And in terms of millions of Americans, that 24% is the percentage of the 90 million weekly podcast consumers 18 plus that we have in the United States. That ends up being about 21.5 million Americans. So if you were just to compare the gap between the percentage of non-podcast listeners who have heard of Athletic Greens and the percentage of podcast listeners who have heard of Athletic Greens, that's a gap that goes from 10 million to about 21.5 million. But that's not even the fairest comparison. The fairest comparison here would be to look at that 6% if you were to take 6% of the existing podcast listening audience and say, what about the podcast audience? If they had never heard an ad for Athletic Greens, what would awareness be amongst that audience for Athletic Greens? And if you were to take that 6% and apply it to the podcast listening audience before Athletic Greens ever advertised, that number would be about 5.5 million Americans. So 5.5 million weekly podcast consumers if Athletic Greens had never advertised in podcasting, but they have in fact advertised. And so now about 21.5 million podcast consumers. That's a difference of about 15 million, nearly 16 million humans, right? That's more humans than watch both Chicago Med and Chicago Fire and young Sheldon, and 60 Minutes in a typical week, right? That's about how many million Americans we're looking at. So that's not a small number. It's certainly not a small number from a percentage standpoint, but I'm here to tell you it's a significant number in terms of actual raw millions of Americans. So if you are a brand that is trying to introduce itself, that is fairly new to the market, you can actually make an incredible difference, not just in percentage, which can be driven simply by being small and then being not so small, but in terms of actual millions of Americans, it is possible to significantly grow reach and impact reach just with podcast advertising alone. And I know that's something that Athletic Greens has discovered. And so though they do not sponsor this podcast or Sounds Profitable, I'm going to enjoy a delicious Athletic Greens now. I'm Tom Webster. I'll see you next week for Data Decoded. Thanks for watching.